Actor Chuck Connors died today. Connors was best known for his role in the television series The Rifleman. But before he made it on the big screen, Connors spent some time on the diamond as a professional baseball player. Connors died of lung cancer. He was 71.
Every week, he stood tall as the steady, moral, and unshakable Rifleman. But that version of the show was only an act. Behind the scenes were unsettling decisions viewers never knew about, shocking moments that didn't make the final cut, and a man slowly losing his own family and health in the most heartbreaking way possible. Years later, what Connors finally admitted about his time on The Rifleman was so painful it permanently changed how the show and the man would be remembered. Chuck Connors was almost not Lucas McCain. One of the most surprising truths about The Rifleman is how close the show came to existing without Chuck Connors at its center. Today, it's nearly impossible to imagine Lucas McCain played by anyone else, but it almost didn't happen. Surprisingly, Connors was, in fact, the first actor offered the role of Lucas McCain when the series was being developed in 1957. This wasn't a case of him being discovered late in the process or winning out over dozens of competitors. From the beginning, the producers saw him as their ideal lead. The problem wasn't talent, it was money. At the time, Connors was earning solid pay in feature films, particularly westerns, where budgets were significantly higher than television. Television was still considered a step down for film actors, both financially and professionally. When the offer for The Rifleman came in, Connors felt the salary simply didn't match his market value, so he turned it down. This decision immediately complicated things for the production. Connors wasn't just another capable actor, he was unusually tall, physically imposing, and instantly believable as a frontier rancher. At 6'5", he filled the frame in a way few television actors could. Losing him forced the producers to rethink their casting strategy and, more importantly, their budget. With Connors declining, the studio began exploring less expensive alternatives. Among the names seriously considered was James Whitmore, a respected character actor with strong stage credentials and an established film career. Whitmore had the acting range and gravitas to play a Western lead, and he was known for his disciplined performances. Another contender was John Anderson, a familiar face in Western television who brought authority and experience with frontier roles. Both men were capable. Neither choice would have sunk the show. But there was something missing. The character, Lucas McCain, wasn't just meant to be a gunman or a stoic rancher. The entire premise of the show depended on the relationship between a widowed father and his young son. The show required an actor who could project strength without coldness, discipline without cruelty, and authority without distance. Casting someone who felt too rigid or emotionally remote would have undermined the very heart of the series. That's when the producers took another look at Connors. Just a year earlier, Connors had appeared in Old Yeller, playing the father of characters portrayed by Tommy Kirk and Kevin Corcoran. The producers discovered that Connors was completely convincing with children on screen. He embodied fatherhood, and his interactions felt natural, grounded, and unforced. This was the missing piece. The show would live or die on whether audiences believed Lucas McCain as a parent. The son, Mark McCain, wasn't a side character, but the emotional center of the series. And so, recognizing what they stood to lose, the producers made a rare move for the time. They raised the salary offer and went back to Connors. By most accounts, Connors was actually surprised. Television productions didn't usually adjust budgets to accommodate actors, especially for a new series with no proven audience. But The Rifleman wasn't a standard Western, and the producers knew it. Connors accepted the revised terms, and with that decision, the identity of the show was locked in. Once filming began, it became clear why replacing him would have been nearly impossible. Connor's athletic background gave authenticity to the rifle work and physical demands of the role. But most importantly, his presence allowed the character of Lucas McCain to be both formidable and gentle. A man capable of violence when necessary, but deeply committed to raising his son with restraint and principle. Had Connors stayed away, the Rifleman might still have existed, but it would not have been the same show. Surprisingly, this wasn't the only time the show came close to turning out differently. The shocking origins of the script. What most viewers never realized is that The Rifleman didn't begin as its own idea at all. Its foundation came from a script that was never meant for Lucas McCain and wasn't even written for his world. The original script was written by Sam Peckinpah, years before he became widely known for directing the film The Wild Bunch. At the time, Peckinpah was working steadily in television, writing Western material that leaned darker and more morally complex than what networks usually preferred. His script was originally intended as a pilot for Gunsmoke, which was already one of the most successful shows on television. At first, it seemed like the perfect script. Gunsmoke dominated the Western genre, and networks were hungry for strong scripts that could deepen its world. But when CBS executives reviewed Peckinpah's submission, they rejected the script. The reason wasn't quality, but the tone. The script carried a heavier emotional weight than what CBS wanted for Gunsmoke. It focused less on law enforcement and procedure and more on personal conflict, restraint, and the consequences of violence. Executives felt it didn't match the identity they had carefully built around Marshal Matt Dillon. So the script was rejected and filed away. For nearly 3 years, it sat unused. During that time, television westerns multiplied rapidly, but most followed familiar patterns: lone lawmen, gunfights, clear villains, and fast resolutions. Peckinpah's script didn't fit comfortably into that mold, and for a while, it appeared it never would. But then producers revisiting old material came across it again. Rather than forcing it into Gunsmoke's structure, they saw an opportunity to reshape it into something entirely different. Peckinpah himself reworked the script by redirecting it. The first major change was the lead character. Instead of another lawman in a familiar role, Peckinpah renamed the protagonist Lucas McCain, giving him a life outside the badge. McCain wasn't a marshal or sheriff by trade. He was a rancher, a widower, and a man trying to live quietly despite his past. But the most important addition was a son. By introducing Mark McCain, Peckinpah transformed the story's emotional core. Westerns at the time rarely centered on parenthood, especially not fatherhood as an ongoing responsibility. Violence was no longer just about survival or justice. It carried consequences that a child would witness and question. The weapon choice was also deliberate. Peckinpah shifted the focus away from pistols and centered the action around a rifle. That decision slowed down the violence, changed how confrontations unfolded, and gave Lucas McCain a distinctive identity. Finally, Peckinpah leaned into moral tension. Episodes weren't just about who was right or wrong, but about how violence affected families, children, and communities. The moral lessons weren't delivered as speeches, but were lived through choices Lucas made in front of his son. These changes didn't just save the rejected script, they transformed it. What CBS once dismissed as unsuitable for Gunsmoke became the backbone of The Rifleman, one of the most successful westerns of its era. But there was one problem. The rifle that made the show famous, the very weapon that defined Lucas McCain, wasn't exactly what viewers thought it was. And the truth behind how it actually worked would leave you completely shocked. The legendary weapon. The firearm carried by Lucas McCain became one of the most recognizable objects in television history. It wasn't just a prop or a background detail, it was inseparable from the character himself. Anytime the rifle showed up on screen, viewers instantly knew what show they were watching. According to producer Arnold Lavin, the rifle used on the series carried real Hollywood history. Lavin later stated that it was the same gun previously used in the film Stagecoach from 1939, starring John Wayne. This claim gave the weapon a kind of pedigree rarely associated with television at the time. Technically, the rifle was a Winchester Model 1892, chambered in .44-40 caliber. What made it visually distinctive was its oversized loop lever. This modification was added so Chuck Connors could spin the rifle smoothly and cycle rounds rapidly without losing control. This modification eventually became central to the show's identity. In the opening credits of The Rifleman, Connors fired 12 shots in rapid succession, a sequence that instantly separated the series from every other Western on television. It was bold, unforgettable, and unlike anything audiences had seen before. But behind the spectacle was a disturbing detail that historians quickly noticed. The series was set in the 1870s and 1880s, shortly after the Civil War. However, the Winchester model did not exist during that time. As a matter of fact, the rifle wasn't introduced until 1892, placing it more than a decade outside the show's historical setting. This discrepancy wasn't minor. Firearms historians and Western purists were quick to point it out. Some joked that Lucas McCain would have needed a time machine to own such a rifle. Others criticized the show for prioritizing visual flair over period accuracy, especially since Westerns often marketed themselves as grounded in real history. While the criticism was valid, from a production standpoint, the decision was deliberate. Earlier rifles that would have been accurate for the era simply couldn't perform the way the show demanded. The rapid-fire sequence in the opening credits wouldn't have been possible with older models. And so the producers chose consistency over strict authenticity, betting that audiences would care more about the rifle than whether the timeline made sense. They were right. The rifle didn't just define Lucas McCain's fighting style, it defined the rhythm of the show itself. Still, the historical inconsistency remained a controversial topic. Some viewers found it annoying, while others simply accepted it as part of the show. A reminder that television sometimes changes history for the sake of storytelling. But this wasn't the only way The Rifleman quietly defied expectations. Beyond its weaponry and action, the series challenged ideologies that many shows of its era avoided entirely in casting, storytelling, and themes. The ways The Rifleman broke barriers. When The Rifleman premiered, it looked like another Western. A frontier town, a skilled gunman, weekly conflicts. But underneath that structure, the show was doing things American television had rarely attempted before, and the most obvious departure was its central family dynamic. Lucas McCain was a widowed single father, raising his son alone in a genre dominated by loners, lawmen, and emotionally unavailable drifters. In the late 1950s, this was highly unusual. Television fathers were typically supported by wives, or they appeared as authority figures without much emotional presence. Lucas McCain didn't fit either model. He cooked, disciplined, protected, and guided his son on his own. On top of that, the show presented it as normal. Much of this came from the writing of Sam Peckinpah, who insisted that the father-son relationship be treated seriously. Discipline existed, but so did affection. Lucas corrected Mark when he was wrong, but he also listened to him. This approach left a lasting mark on television history. Later Westerns like Bonanza, with Ben Cartwright raising his sons, followed a similar structure. Decades later, family-centered dramas would treat single-parent households as routine. The show also broke barriers in how it handled violence. Most westerns of the era leaned heavily on shootouts for momentum. The Rifleman didn't avoid this action. In fact, it featured some of the fastest and most memorable gunplay on television. But it rarely treated violence as entertainment alone. Each episode balanced action and violence with moral lessons and consequences. In fact, after every conflict, Lucas would talk with Mark about what happened and why certain choices had to be made. Honesty, justice, mercy, responsibility. These lessons were woven into the story. Most episodes dealt with real societal issues like prejudice, loyalty, false accusations, and second chances. Lucas often stood up for outsiders or pushed back when a crowd rushed to judge someone. These scenes broke down problems viewers were already familiar with, even though the show never called them out directly. Another barrier the show crossed was its treatment of child characters. Johnny Crawford, cast as Mark McCain, was given equal narrative importance. The storylines unfolded from his perspective as often as his father's. His mistakes were important, and so was his growth. At a time when children in westerns were usually background figures or simply comic relief, Mark McCain was a central character. His presence changed how stories were written and paced, forcing later television shows to consider long-term emotional impact rather than quick resolution. The show also stood apart because of the people it brought on screen. Over the years, The Rifleman featured many guest actors who were just starting out. Names like Dennis Hopper, Michael Landon, and Robert Culp appeared on the show long before most viewers knew who they were. At a time when westerns mostly featured popular actors, The Rifleman gave chances to younger performers and fresh talent. For many of them, this opportunity helped open doors that later led to major careers in television and film. Another way The Rifleman broke boundaries was with its filming techniques. Sam Peckinpah and producer Arnold Lavin wanted the show to feel more like a movie than a typical weekly program. While other westerns used simple camera setups, The Rifleman paid attention to how each scene was filmed. The series used close-up shots to capture emotional tension and deliberate pacing that gave important moments time to sink in. Eventually, this approach helped change how television dramas were made. Other shows began borrowing these same techniques, using film-style storytelling instead of stiff, basic camera work. The truth is, The Rifleman was rare for its time, but not everyone was comfortable with that. Behind the scenes, and sometimes in public reaction, the show stirred debate. Its moral stance, its portrayal of authority, and its willingness to complicate right and wrong didn't sit well with everyone watching. The controversial side of The Rifleman. When The Rifleman premiered in 1958, it didn't take long for controversy to follow. While audiences embraced the show, critics quickly labeled it one of the most violent programs on television, a surprising distinction for a series that also positioned itself as family-oriented. This concern centered largely on the way violence was presented. At the time, The Rifleman aired around the same time as The Untouchables, another series frequently criticized for its blunt depictions of crime and gunplay. Together, the two shows became reference points in a growing debate about how much violence was acceptable on American television, especially during hours when children were likely watching. Lucas McCain's rifle played a major role in that debate. Newspaper reviewers and television commentators argued that the rapid-fire action risked glorifying gun violence, particularly for young audiences. Some warned that repeated exposure to such imagery could normalize firearms as problem solvers rather than last resorts. The fact that the rifle was so visually distinctive only amplified those concerns. Defenders of the show pointed out how violence was almost always framed with consequences. Lucas McCain never shot recklessly, and episodes consistently emphasized restraint and responsibility. But once the criticism stuck, it became part of the show's reputation. Surprisingly, the controversy didn't stop with gunplay. Unlike many westerns of the era, The Rifleman didn't avoid darker subject matter. It quietly introduced themes that other family-friendly programs refused to touch, often without signaling that it was doing anything unusual. One of the most striking examples was the recurring character Michael Torrance, the town marshal. Torrance was not portrayed as a flawless authority figure. He struggled openly with alcoholism, a subject rarely acknowledged on 1950s television, let alone shown as a problem. His drinking impaired his judgment, weakened his authority, and left him vulnerable at critical moments. Rather than treating this as a one-off flaw, the series wove it into the fabric of the town. Villains often exploited Torrance's addiction, using alcohol to manipulate him or remove him from power long enough to destabilize North Fork. When chaos followed, Lucas McCain was forced to step in as a citizen, trying to keep order when official authority failed. This portrayal was unusually blunt for its time. Most westerns kept their sheriffs and marshals idealized, dependable, and morally certain. The Rifleman allowed an authority figure to be weak, compromised, and deeply human. This choice added realism to the show, but it also unsettled viewers who preferred clearer lines between right and wrong. By introducing themes like addiction, corruption, and moral vulnerability, the show pushed past the safe boundaries of the genre. It broke away from the idea that violence comes only from villains. Instead, it showed that sometimes it emerges when institutions fail, or when good people struggle with their own flaws. For adult viewers, this complexity made the show richer, but for critics and parent groups, it raised concerns. Parent and teacher associations in the late 1950s and early 60s questioned whether The Rifleman was appropriate for children. Their criticism focused on the combination of violence and mature themes presented in a format that looked accessible to younger audiences. Yet, despite, or perhaps because of, the controversy, the series has more impact. It remained popular, respected, and widely watched. Its willingness to take risks became part of its identity, separating it from safer, more predictable westerns. And that pattern extended beyond the screen. Because the man at the center of it all, Chuck Connors, carried contradictions of his own. While the public saw a disciplined father figure and moral anchor, there was another darker side of Connors that remained carefully hidden from the cameras. The dark side of Chuck Connors. On screen, Lucas McCain was presented as a perfect role model. Across 168 episodes of The Rifleman, the character was shown smoking a cigarette only once. This detail was a conscious choice made by the producers and network. Lucas McCain was meant to embody discipline. He didn't drink heavily, he didn't gamble, he didn't indulge in visible vices. For younger viewers especially, he was designed to be someone worth watching and learning from. However, behind the scenes, the reality was very different. In his private life, Chuck Connors was a heavy smoker. By multiple accounts from those who worked with him, Connors regularly consumed up to 60 cigarettes a day. Smoking was woven into his routine between takes, during rehearsals, and off-set. At the time, this wasn't considered unusual. During the 1950s and 60s, smoking carried a very different cultural meaning. The habit was openly advertised on television. In fact, adverts frequently featured doctors and athletes endorsing specific brands. The long-term dangers of smoking were not yet widely accepted by the public. Off-screen, Connors carried habits that slowly worked against his health. And as the years passed and science changed, the consequences became harder to ignore. By the later decades of Connor's life, the medical community had firmly linked smoking to lung disease and cancer. What had once been marketed as harmless was now understood as deadly. Sadly, for Connors, the damage had already been done. He began experiencing serious health problems tied to decades of tobacco use. The physical strength that once defined him, the same athleticism that made McCain believable, slowly deteriorated. In 1992, Connors died at the age of 71. The official cause of death was lung cancer, complicated by pneumonia. It was a quiet ending for someone who had embodied resilience and authority for millions of viewers. But smoking wasn't the only contradiction in Connors's life. Away from the set, his personal relationships, beliefs, and choices were far more complicated than what he projected on screen. There were tensions, loyalties, and controversies that never appeared in promotional material or fan magazines. The man audiences trusted every week carried stories that didn't align neatly with the role that defined him. And once those stories began to surface, they challenged the idea that Chuck Connors was as straightforward as McCain seemed to be. Connors' 4 sons from his first marriage would later describe a childhood marked more by absence than presence. In interviews and biographical accounts published years after his death, they spoke of a father who was frequently away, consumed by work, public appearances, and personal pursuits that kept him distant from home. On television, the character he portrayed was defined by availability. He listened, he corrected. However, off-screen, some accounts suggest Connors was rarely around during his son's formative years. Connors' first marriage was to Elizabeth Jane Riddell, whom he married in 1948, before his television stardom. Together, they had 4 sons: Michael, Jeffrey, Stephen, and Kevin. The marriage appeared stable, at least publicly. However, privately, things were really complicated. The marriage lasted 13 years, ending in 1962, right as The Rifleman reached peak popularity. Reports and later accounts described a relationship strained by Connors' demanding career and frequent time away from home. Biographers and family sources also cited infidelity as a persistent issue, along with claims that Connors fathered children outside the marriage, allegations he never publicly addressed. After the divorce was finalized in 1962, Connors' private life began to fracture further. In 1963, he married Kamala Devi, an actress of Indian descent, who had worked steadily in film and television. At the time, interracial marriages in Hollywood were still rare and often scrutinized. The relationship attracted attention almost immediately. Unfortunately, their marriage lasted less than a decade, ending in the early 1970s. During those years, rumors followed them, including reports of volatile arguments, continued affairs, and alleged abusive behavior. Despite private strain, Connors and Devi made public appearances together and even worked on the same projects. They co-starred in the film Geronimo, released in 1962, presenting a unified front to audiences. But behind the scenes, the marriage struggled under the same pressures that had affected Connors' first marriage. Connors married for a 3rd time in 1977, this time to Faith Quabius, a former model significantly younger than him. The age difference drew attention in Hollywood circles, and the relationship quickly became a subject of controversy. This marriage lasted just 3 years, ending in 1980. Those close to Connors described the relationship as brief and unstable, reflecting a pattern that had become familiar. By this point, Connors' struggles with long-term stability were evident. While his professional image remained controlled and guarded, his personal relationships continued to fracture. Yet, Connors never publicly admitted to infidelity or wrongdoing. He maintained a careful public image, rarely discussing his private life in interviews and deflecting questions that strayed beyond his work. Fan magazines and television profiles largely preserved the image of the strong, disciplined father figure audiences trusted. It wasn't until after his death in 1992 that a fuller picture emerged. Family members, biographers, and those who worked closely with Connors began sharing more candid accounts. They spoke about a man who struggled to balance fame, family, and personal discipline. A man whose private choices often conflicted with the role that defined his legacy. And yet, despite everything that followed him off-screen, Connors rarely spoke negatively about the Rifleman itself. In fact, toward the end of his life, his reflections on the show were strikingly sober and tinged with something close to regret. Because the way The Rifleman ended and the reason it couldn't continue carried consequences Connors never fully escaped. Why The Rifleman ended. When The Rifleman premiered in 1958, it arrived at the height of America's fascination with Westerns. The genre dominated primetime television, and the series quickly found an audience. Over 5 seasons, it produced a strong run by any standard of the era. But by the early 1960s, the television landscape was changing. Audience tastes began shifting away from frontier stories toward crime dramas, courtroom series, and sitcoms. Westerns no longer felt new. Networks that once relied on them as guaranteed successes started reassessing their schedules, looking for fresher formats that reflected modern life. ABC executives noticed the change clearly. While The Rifleman remained respected, its ratings had slipped noticeably compared to its early seasons. It was no longer the breakout hit it once had been, and television economics left little room for sentiment. But that wasn't the only problem. The high cost of production became another influencing factor. Unlike many Westerns that relied heavily on reused sets and simple staging, The Rifleman leaned into a more cinematic approach. Action-heavy episodes, frequent guest stars, and location shooting all increased expenses. As the ratings declined, the network became less willing to support a show that cost more to produce than its competitors. To make matters worse, competition within the Western genre also intensified. By 1963, Westerns like Bonanza and Gunsmoke dominated the schedule. Both benefited from broader ensemble casts and, increasingly, color broadcasts, which gave them a visual advantage. The Rifleman, still filmed in black and white, began to feel dated to some viewers, despite its strong storytelling. At the same time, ABC faced mounting pressure and criticism over portraying violence through television. Parent groups and watchdog organizations had already criticized programs like The Untouchables, and scrutiny extended to Westerns as well. Even though The Rifleman consistently balanced violence with moral lessons, its reputation as a fast-paced, gun-heavy show worked against it during a period of growing concern over what children were watching at home. Soon, the decision became inevitable, and in 1963, ABC canceled The Rifleman. For Chuck Connors, the ending was bittersweet, but not unexpected. In interviews later in life, Connors repeatedly emphasized that the father-son relationship between Lucas and Mark McCain had always been the heart of the show. He believed that this emotional core set The Rifleman apart from Westerns that focused solely on gunfights and spectacle. Connors was particularly protective of how Lucas McCain was portrayed. He wanted the character to remain moral and upright, even when violence was unavoidable. To him, Lucas wasn't a man who enjoyed conflict. He was someone who used force reluctantly, always with an eye toward responsibility and example. As the series ended, Connors acknowledged that The Rifleman had likely run its course. Television was moving on, and so was the genre. Still, He remained grateful for the role, later describing Lucas McCain as the most important character of his career. That gratitude never faded. Even years after the show ended, Connors continued to embrace his association with Lucas McCain. He appeared regularly at Western conventions, anniversary events, and interviews, always speaking about the Rifleman with pride and nostalgia. He hoped audiences would remember the series not only for the rifle, but for what it stood for: fatherhood, integrity, justice, and accountability. What do you think about the way The Rifleman ended? Drop your answers in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.